Hello, my name is Fayzan. I'm a Muslim American. I'm a fourth-year medical student here at Emory, and I'm a psychedelic researcher. I want to talk about two things that we normally don't talk about in the same sentence: Islam and psychedelics. Now, for many of you in the crowd, those are two fairly niche, somewhat esoteric topics that you have little to no relationship to. But my hope in this talk is that you'll see what sits at the intersection of those two represents the next frontier in our mental health care system. I want to begin with a story. It's about someone named Alia. She actually represents an amalgamation of many other people I've gotten to meet over the last few years. Alia grew up in the Midwest to a conservative Muslim family. She went to the mosque on Fridays with her dad. She fasted during the holy month of Ramadan. And she split her identity between a Muslim side and an American side. Even after she gave up wearing the hijab, religion and faith were a core part of her identity. After college, Alia moved to the San Francisco Bay Area. She got a job in a biotech firm there, working as a lead scientist. And it was around that time that she started to develop early signs of mental illness. At first, it was subtle. Hard to get out of the bed, felt like a weight was on her chest. And then it was anxiety and paranoia and outbursts. And then slowly but surely, she started to withdraw more and more from her friends and family. Alia knew she was struggling, but she wasn't sure who she could turn to. She called up her dad one day, and her dad said, "Hey, all you need to do is pray more and read from the Quran." Now, Alia, that wasn't really the advice that Alia was looking for. So out of desperation, she turned to a few of her friends and asked what they did. And they told her, "Hey, you're just in your head too much. You just got to be a little bit more social and this will completely go away." Alia wasn't really feeling like either one of those were really getting her what she needed. She decided to do a few different things. She talked to multiple therapists, tried a few different mental health medications before she sat down with a therapist who suggested she may be a good candidate for a psychedelic clinical trial. Now, it's worth me pausing in Alia's story for a moment to talk about psychedelics. When I first learned about psychedelics, it was in my high school drug ed class. And I was told that psychedelics are those things that people take in clubs, and they cause you to melt your mind and go crazy and jump out of windows. But what that doesn't really take into account is over the last decade, there's been a lot of promising research that's come out that psychedelics, when used in scientific and in clinical settings, actually can help people break through some of our hardest to treat mental health conditions. Things like PTSD, OCD, anxiety, treatment-resistant depression. Now, how exactly does that work? On your left, you'll see something called psilocybin mushrooms, or more commonly known as magic mushrooms. And for a while, these were just things that were used in sacramental settings in some parts of Central America, some parts of South America, until they made their way to the US. On your left, you'll actually see, or on your right, you'll actually see the synthetic version of that that's actually metabolized by taking the active molecule there and putting it into a pill form. Now, what's happening in our clinical trials here in the United States is that we'll give someone something like the psilocybin mushrooms in a pill form, and two therapists will actually sit with them in a room, and those participants will go through an altered state of consciousness for about 6 to 8 hours. For a lot of people in those therapeutic settings, religious content, spiritual content, existential content starts to appear. Now, this is all really intriguing to Alia when she first heard it, but she was a scientist. She wanted to do a little bit of her own research, and as she was looking at scientific publications that were coming around that time, she found some stuff that she had never seen before in scientific reports. There were psychedelic trial participants who were reporting their experience was as significant as the birth of their first child or the death of a parent. She had never seen language like that appear in scientific journals before. And yet, she felt torn. She wasn't feeling better. All the medications she had in the past weren't really helping. And yet, she was a Muslim. She had dabbled in marijuana a couple times in college, but for the most part, Muslims don't take psychedelics. Spiritual experiences, kind of sounded blasphemous. She was torn. Things weren't getting better, and her condition needed some help. And she ultimately decided to take a leap of faith. When Alia went through her psychedelic experience, it was profound for her. Alia was so excited to actually share what had happened with her therapist. She shows up, she walks into her room, and she's handed this. This is a standard tool that's used in a lot of our mental health clinics. In the United States, we often like to quantify and measure the way mental health symptoms are changing over time. And when Alia walked in that day, her therapist wanted to know, had her symptoms actually improved as a result of the psychedelic experience? Alia sat down and she patiently answered each question. And when she handed it back to her therapist congratulated her and said, "Alia, this is the lowest you ever scored." But for Alia, there was a little bit of a disconnect. She had just gone through an identity-changing experience, and yet her therapist wanted to talk to her about her symptoms. She didn't know who would really get it. She thought about talking to a Muslim clergy member and a mom, but thought better for it. Psychedelics and clergy member, that didn't really seem like it really fit well. When she shared with a couple of friends what she'd went through, they told her she was crazy for some of the stuff that came out. Alia started to feel alone. She didn't know who or where she belonged to. Sure, her initial mental health symptoms were better, but she was starting to feel worse and worse. U.S. Muslim adults were twice as likely to commit suicide than the next religious group, including atheists and agnostics. Even before I had seen this stat, I had seen these types of dynamics in the Muslim communities that I grew up in. People who struggled with things like anxiety, depression, issues around their gender, their sexuality, had difficulty actually bringing that up inside of their Muslim families, let alone mosques or community spaces. Compound that with there's just not that many Muslim therapists or providers, you have the perfect storm for why you would see that type of statistic. It was around that time that I also was reading the same type of stuff that Alia was seeing in scientific journals. And I was also blown away by the potential for psychedelics to treat mental illness. But I was also noticing that the majority of the participants were white. There were very few minorities being included in the initial psychedelic clinical trials. And I worried that there was a gap there, that for all the advances we were seeing in our science, would it actually be relevant to all the different groups of people? As I started to meet the Alias of the world, it planted a seed in me. I wanted to spend my time at Emory actually looking at, could Islam and psychedelics actually come together? And initially, it wasn't too promising. When I spoke to religious scholars, doctors, therapists, and I mentioned this idea of bridging Islam and psychedelics, I got this reaction, that Islam and psychedelics are like oil and water, that Islam has such specific rules around intoxicants such as alcohol, the idea of entertaining a psychedelic would be heinous. And yet, I had a felt sense that there had to be something here, that a lot of the psychedelics came from cultures in which they had been used in sacramental and spiritual places. And there were the people like Alia that I was meeting, and I had a sense that there had to be something there. It took me a little bit of time before I found this person. This is Ibn Arabi. He's a 13th century Sufi mystic who reported a philosophy called Wajad al-Wakad, which means unity of all beings and things. Ibn Arabi's work really struck me. The same language that he was using in the 13th century was similar to the language that I was seeing come out of psychedelic trial participants. Let me give you an example. This is from Ibn Arabi. Death does not exist in reality, neither for the universe nor for the human. It's simply a change from one state to another. Let's compare that for a moment with this psychedelic trial participant, someone who had cancer, who was in the last year of their life and who had been given a psychedelic to work through end-of-life anxiety. This is what she says. I've died and I'm below the ground in this gorgeous forest, deep woods, loamy and brown. I'm seeing the trees grow and I'm part of them. I don't feel sad or happy, just natural, content, peaceful. I wasn't gone. I was just part of the earth. I hope that moves you as much as it moves me. To see across generations and across cultures, people talking about really similar concepts. And it was in that commonality that I started to explore more, and the world really opened up. I found societies in ancient Iran and Afghanistan that used a form of hashish to initiate people in coming-of-age ceremonies in their Islamic traditions. I met groups of Muslims who engaged in extended periods of fasting to induce an altered state of consciousness in order to connect to the divine. Sure, those groups were not using psychedelics in the way that we're talking about here, but there was a history I was finding of altered states of consciousness. I decided to commission the first ever study on psychedelics in Islam. We looked at perceptions that Muslims had in the United States around psychedelics. And what I found kind of blew me away, that half of the people who responded to our online survey reported that they had a first-degree connection to a psychedelic. That means that either they themselves or someone as close to them as a family member had interacted with a psychedelic. Now, I know what a few of you are thinking, that, all right, the people who are going to fill out a psychedelic survey are going to be the people who've taken psychedelics. But even if you look at the absolute number of people who said yes to that question, there's a significant number of Muslims in this country that have had encounters with the psychedelic. So as I zoom out, I see all these different components. I see a faith history, a tradition. I see a number of people having the experience that Alia was having. And I realize that we're maybe in the right moment now to consider, how do we bridge these different things? All the components are there. It's just a question of how do we bring them together. Let me bring you to the current moment. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, just received its first application to approve a psychedelic. And it's highly likely that later this year, doctors will be able to prescribe psychedelics in clinic. And even afterwards, it'll be likely that many other centers will start to open up in the coming years. The scientific evidence that psychedelics can help treat mental illness has been substantiated. But what has not been substantiated is how to make sure that this innovation in our mental health care system doesn't fall into the same trap as so many other scientific clinical trials, which are effective in those settings, but when we actually introduce them to the real world, are lacking. The people that I've gotten to spend time with as I've done this research have included rabbis who have thought about how to integrate elements of the Torah with Jewish members of their faith that are trying to integrate psychedelic experiences. It's been Baptist clergy members in the South who are worried about losing people in their congregation if they can't speak to the psychedelic experience. And I've met African Americans in the South who have been scarred by the way our psychiatry system has treated them in the past, but have an openness to psychedelics as something different, alternative. Their only ask is, how do we actually make sure you're meeting us where we are at? I hope it's abundantly clear by now that I'm not just talking about Islam and psychedelics. I'm talking about all religious and cultural minorities who are yearning to actually find some healing. I think if we were to paint a different vision of what's possible, one that includes space for all minorities in our innovations, we can create something that's impactful. We have to imagine a reality that not only just works for Alia, but people like Alia's dad. And I want to spend a few minutes actually painting that. I imagine in a world where Alia's dad gets referred to psychedelic treatment, he gets the opportunity to meet with a therapist and a Muslim chaplain. He's asked about both his mental health symptoms and his spiritual and religious beliefs. He's briefed before he goes into the experience that psychedelics may bring up religious, spiritual, and theological material for you, and to be aware of that. When he shows up the day of his psychedelic experience, he's given the opportunity to get grounded in things that are true for his faith and his religious identity. Things like praying namaz before he actually takes the medicine, or bringing in Islamic art that actually is meaningful to him, or a picture of his ancestor, a great-grandfather, who may be significant and meaningful in his own life. After that experience, he'd get the opportunity to learn about people like Ibn Arabi and connect what he just went through with a broader lineage and history that exists within his faith tradition. Afterwards, if he's feeling up for it, he could be referred to an integration group of other Muslims of his age and get the opportunity to go through and integrate that experience, not just alone, but with other people who are working on how to make sense and make that real in their lives. I think if we paint that vision, we actually can make our modalities and our treatments relevant. Not just in the clinic, not just in our clinical trials, but out in the real world. So as I wrap up, I have a few different asks for you today. If you are Muslim or you are a religious or cultural minority, I want you to know that you are not alone. There are people using psychedelics for a number of different reasons, and to actually be in conversation around that, take that step. If you're a doctor or a mental health care practitioner, my ask to you is to acknowledge that psychedelics are not just your standard mental health care medications. For many people, they are religious and spiritual and cultural, and that when you work with those patients, to speak into those identities. And for everyone else, my ask to you is that this requires a movement with the way we think about healing. That for too long, our institutions of religion and culture have been separate from our institutions of medicine and science. And that if we really want to unlock a true healing with our innovations, we have to bring those together. Thank you.